Join now. And we are ready to go. Thank you so much for joining us on the second day of the Grand Bargain Cash Workstream webinar series. I'm Holly Welcome-Radice, the Global Cash and Markets Technical Advisor at CARE, and I will be your main host for the day. I'm also the co-convener for the Gender Cash sub-Workstream, which is the workstream that you have joined today. Just as a reminder, for those that are less familiar, the Gender Cash sub-Workstream focuses on the intersection of policy, practice, and research at gender and cash and voucher assistance. And today we will be, we have 3 points on our agenda. We will have a fireside chat. We will look at progress in 2019 to 2020, and then we'll look ahead for 2020-2021. We will start out with a fireside chat entitled "What is Getting in Our Way?" A conversation on #GenderCash. And I'm really excited to be able to have 4 excellent panelists. Anna Nicole, who is the policy analyst for the Bureau of Population, Refugees, and Migration, otherwise known as PRM, at the U.S. Department of State. Elena Potts, who's a research scientist at the Global Women's Institute of George Washington University. Tenzin Manel, who's a senior technical advisor of cash and livelihoods at the Women's Refugee Commission, and Sandra Watange Hart, who is the Pacific Cash and Livelihoods lead in Oxfam, Vanuatu. So I wanted to start out this conversation with an important person, a project participant, so that we can see from her perspective the potential of cash and voucher assistance. So let's look at this together. So I'd like to invite the panelists to our chat. If you want to open up your video, Anna Nicole and Sandra. Well, thank you all for joining again. So we can see that cash and voucher assistance can really transform the lives of crisis-affected people, as it did with Mary. What we want to look at today is how can we make this systematic and not just the exception. So I have 3 questions for you ladies. The first question is this. We've heard various agencies mention cash and gender at the Grand Bargain meeting, and we like to think that it's a sign of success for our cause. From your perspective, what is one win, one gain, one improvement that you have seen or noted connected #GenderCash since the last Grand Bargain meeting? We're going to start out with Anna.
Sure. Hey, everyone. Thank you, Holly. So just a couple of points. And again, I really tried to approach this question from the higher level policy perspective, because I'll let my colleagues kind of speak on the research and the more programmatic perspective as well. So I think looking at it from that kind of that policy frame, I think one of the things that we've done really well in the past year is ensuring that gender sensitivity is permeating these policy documents, these higher level policy documents, as much as we can, because this is what's really driving programming. So we've made progress and strides on this in the past year in a couple of different ways. I think in a good way, I think COVID-19 has forced our hand on this a little bit, on thinking critically about both gender and cash. That cash is such a significant part of the response, and I think it's going to continue to be as we plan for long-term economic recovery. And also thinking about the disparate impacts that the crisis has had on populations as a result of their gender. And so I think this work stream, I think, has responded really quickly and it really advanced this dialogue through a two-pager that was produced a couple of months ago, I think in May, really calling on partners to ensure response analyses, and then programs were gendered and responsive to different needs of women, men, boys, and girls. And I think looking back at kind of the donor level, donor-led policy documents as well, they've increasingly included references to gender, which has been really, really key, I think. The Donor Cash Forum, for example, produced a paper on humanitarian cash transfers in the response to COVID-19, as well as documents produced by the Grand Bargain Cash and Social Protection sub-work group, all included references to gender sensitivities. But again, I think I would challenge, and I'm sure we'll talk about this a little bit more too, is that, you know, it's more than just referencing, so hopefully we can take this a little bit further in the coming years and really increase that focus in those higher level policy documents on gender and cash, and perhaps even have a standalone gender and cash document that pushes the envelope, I think, on this topic.
Great, thanks.
I would say one more thing before, just quickly too, is that I think quality over quantity of cash assistance has really been a big shift that we've been looking at, from maximizing the quantity of cash assistance to the quality of cash assistance. So this is something that the USG has remained really attentive to, and trying to focus on recognizing that our modalities must be selected and crafted based on that context and the individual needs, and that cash is not always the answer. And so I think that this is increasingly part of those dialogues that are happening at those higher levels. So I'll leave it at that. Thanks, Holly.
Great, thanks so much. Moving from policy over a bit to research, Helena, where do you want to share with us?
Yeah, so thanks for having me as part of this conversation. My background is a GBV emergency response. So I will say, just I'll speak to that kind of field and say on the programming side, it's great to see that cash assistance and voucher assistance is included in the GBV minimum standards that were released last year, the interagency standards. It's standard 11. So that's some great guidance around essential programming at the outset of emergencies. And then on the research side, I think we're at a point where there's been a few reviews of research. WRC and IRC did a review last year of 28 studies. Bueller et al. Also released a review of 22 quantitative, 8 qualitative studies 2 years ago. And UN Women did a review last year of cash-based interventions on gender outcomes in development and humanitarian settings. And if we look across all of that, we see, there's no easy answer. It's nuanced. It's very context specific. It's a mixed bag. Mostly the pathways that seem to work between cash transfers and GBV risk are around economic security and emotional well-being, intra-household conflict, women's empowerment. And we see changes, we see effects on violence, but often this is more around physical and sexual, for example, intimate partner violence, rather than emotional abuse or controlling behaviors. And a lot of the work shows that the positive impacts of cash transfers are really are there when we have them accompanied by complementary activities that are gender sensitive. So gender discussion groups or counseling GBV resources, and that staff really need training in both cash and gender areas to implement these effectively. We can also see how they may strengthen women's decision-making capacity, but they also may put other burdens on women, or double burdens of working in the home and then outside the home, or decisions about certain things at household level, but not kind of bigger decisions. The work I do, the research I do at GWI, Empowered Aid is participatory action research in Uganda and Lebanon. And we look at risk of sexual exploitation and abuse in relation to aid distributions. And in Lebanon, one of the forms of aid that the women and girls we work with chose to look at was cash. And they really, they value cash. They see it as critical for their livelihoods. They value unconditional cash transfers because that gives them the freedom to use the funds on what they need to use them on. They did speak about the ease there in that context of using ATMs to access cash, but also the dangers, particularly in getting to an ATM or knowing how to use it safely, and how this can open up exposure to SEA. And so they really called on, having more knowledge, more awareness around how to do this, and around the ways that, different people can use that power that they have, the knowledge of how to access the cash or how to get there and how to get them home, to exploit them. So they called for that. And they also talked about targeting. I'll just say a quick word about targeting. They felt that women and girls who are specifically economically vulnerable, such as female-headed households, widows, etc., should be targeted to mitigate the risk that they face. But then IRC and Jordan, they released a review of their work, and they brought out how targeting can be problematic because it can maybe be seen to further undermine, norms around marriage. And when you're targeting women who aren't married, are you potentially, it could be perceived to contribute to divorce and separation. So I think, we can see how we really need to get in and understand the context and ask people constantly in many different ways the effects that these programs are having on our lives, and listen to them and be ready to be flexible in the amounts and the duration and the types of cash transfers that we do, and give beneficiaries a range of options specific to their needs.
Excellent. Tenzin, you also do research in this intersection. What are some of your thoughts of how we have seen some improvement since last year?
Yeah, thanks, Holly, and everyone who's joining, and to the co-panelists or co-fireside chatters. I think a lot of what we've been working on and what we've found really aligns with what Alina has mentioned. I want to thank Sweden's Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Sweden and WRC are members of the Call to Action on Protection from Gender-Based Violence in Emergencies, as are many of the Grand Bargain folks. And our recent research that we've been able to drive forward to start to address some of the gaps that we identified during the evidence mapping, which Alina mentioned, which IRC and WRC took forward, have been possible because donors have been stepping increasingly forward into funding action research and programming around cash and gender and cash and GBV. And I just want to acknowledge that when we're talking about cash and GBV, we're talking about one area of what we need to tackle within the larger umbrella when we're focusing on cash and gender. So we've been able to, in partnership with CARE, tackle in the last year research on using cash and voucher assistance for gender-based violence outcomes. So we were able to work with local partners in Ecuador to serve Venezuelan migrants who were survivors of gender-based violence. And we found that CVA was supportive of more equitable decision-making within the household, helped to reduce IPV, and helped increase access to services for survivors. So they were able to access sexual and reproductive health services, mental health services, legal services, because cash and voucher assistance was a facilitator to accessing those where they weren't available for free. And we also found many other positives. I just want to flag that in addition to pushing forward the research, we need to make sure that the evidence that we generate is available in a number of different languages so that it can be accessed easily by practitioners around the world, local partners, and then really getting to the uptake from the evidence, right? But if we can't access the evidence equally, then that's going to be an inhibiting factor to pushing forward. So lastly, I just want to flag a few of the evidence gaps that remain, which hopefully we can tackle as a community practice. So one is, even though we have found that cash and voucher assistance can be positive in terms of protecting women and other survivors of gender-based violence and supporting them in their recovery, the evidence base broadly excludes marginalized populations. So we've yet to focus and ask the key research questions for specific populations, including survivors with disabilities, focus on adolescent girls sufficiently, LGBTI individuals. These subpopulations are largely left out of the programming and thus the research. Another is we need to compare the different CVA modalities and their impact. Again, highlighting what others have already mentioned, the importance of focusing on context, ongoing gender and protection analysis. We also need to look at what are the optimal combinations of cash and voucher assistance and other activities and services. So looking at cash plus, and then also look at the longer term impacts, recognizing that these programs are often so short, they need to be longer, not only for survivors, but for our learning. Thanks.
I'm going to virtually turn to Sandra as I can on a panel, but so Tenzin talked about some things that connect to practice, which you all in Oxfam and Vanuatu and in the Pacific have been doing some interesting things. Talk to us about what are some of the progress that you have seen over the past year related to this intersection.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, for those on the call who aren't aware, in the Pacific region, cash is still very, very new. as a delivery modality, as a means of delivering assistance. But even in the short period of time that we've been scaling this up in the Pacific, we've been able to enrich our work through the learning that some of the other panelists have just talked about. So what we've seen here is really a shift in perceptions. So not just looking at cash as a tool or as a modality of assistance, but more as leverage to shift power dynamics and really to recognize the fact that women, men, girls, and boys are economic actors. They exist within a broader economy. So when you deliver cash assistance, when you increase purchasing power, you're really able to shift those relationships in a positive way or in a negative way if your program quality is poor. So for us, most of the work has been around recognizing poverty-related stressors as a driver of GBV in the household. GBV rates in the Pacific are extremely high. So really doing work with communities from a consultative perspective to really understand to what extent do they feel that income is stressing relationships to the point where violence becomes an issue, and using that as an entry point to introduce cash programming as opposed to in-kind assistance that tends to favor the male, mainly around logistical issues in the Pacific. But for us, what this has allowed us to do is integrate gender-sensitive approaches from the get-go. Also look at providing cash to women and other marginalized groups as a pathway to financial inclusion and financial independence. Really starting to break down the level of agency that these stakeholders have within their broader communities and within their economy, and looking at cash as a piece of that puzzle and as a piece of that dynamic, and as something that maybe can increase decision-making capacities or economic inclusion in a way that's not currently accessible to these groups. So that's from the Pacific side. Thanks, Holly.
Great, thanks so much for that, Sandra. So great to see that we have seen progress over the past year in all of our areas of focus within the sub-working group. But it's going to take me to our second question. So talking about gender and cash isn't new. In the early days of cash and voucher assistance, we saw a reference to gender sensitivity. I, in fact, recently saw a report from Oxfam, which was from 2011, which used that term. The communities we serve are asserting that cash and voucher assistance needs to be people-centered and gender-sensitive. So a quote that we have from some of the research that we did within CARE from a cash transfer recipient in Niger, she said, we should be consulted in all the decisions related to the activities, so our needs are prioritized according to our circumstances. And she was speaking from this as a woman. She was also speaking this, as a recipient of humanitarian aid. So part of what we have to tackle is not just good program, which Sandra brought up, of course, but at a systemic level. So from your perspective, what is getting in our way? So Anna, do you want to go ahead?
Sure, thanks, Holly. I'll start us off, and I think this probably won't come as a surprise, but I think gender, really continues to be a check-the-box exercise in cash and frankly beyond cash programming. That's something that is really considered and included in programming in a sincere way. I think, one of the best examples, we were thinking about this the other day in the office, is that CRM has this required gender analysis for our NGO proposals. And more often than not, NGOs try to meet this requirement simply by describing the terrible situations that women and girls are in rather than explaining how their proposal addresses those problems or mitigates potential ways their proposal could inadvertently increase vulnerability for women and girls or men and boys. And we know that gender mainstreaming is really the best way to address GBV, but I think partners frequently throw this term around without truly incorporating gender into their programs. And I think that there's a lot of barriers to this, of course. I think time and staffing are primary among them. But I think it's also about ensuring that gender is much more pervasive in our dialogue on humanitarian issues, making it a core part of our discussion from the get-go, really elevating the importance of gender and including it in all aspects of our discussions as humanitarian partners. So I think that's really important. And I would say, I would say just making sure that it's really part of those dialogues. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. I would also say that along the lines of that quote that you just gave, Holly, on including women and girls in those discussions, is that a key gap, I think, really remains in involving women and girls in decision making and program design, and including local women-led organizations in humanitarian responses. That really continues to be, I think, a key gap in the humanitarian community must address in order for CBA programming to be truly gender sensitive. So I'll leave it at that.
Great. Well, Elena, what are your thoughts on that?
I just want to echo, what Anna was saying about gender and what Sandra was saying earlier about power, and it really comes down to those things. And we work in context with massive power imbalances. So those are along lines of gender as well as other areas. Tenzin mentioned language, which is a really important one, actually. It can be citizenship or nationality, sexual orientation, gender identity, disability, etc. And cash is a very direct expression of power. And so like other forms of aid, having access to it or even access to information about it can be used to exploit and abuse others. And so we really have to think at a systems level when considering the potential for good as well as harm of this kind of aid, and think about how cash can increase, GBV, SEA, etc. I'll share a few examples from empowered aid to illustrate what I mean and to really center the voices of some of the women and girls that we spoke with. And this is looking at, if we think about how cash can interact with power dynamics and a humanitarian response between aid actors and aid recipients. So one of the Syrian adolescent girls we talked to in Lebanon said, they might be asked for something in return in order to receive the cash assistance. They might be harassed or something. She might go to the center, to the organization to receive the assistance, and the employee there might ask her to do something in order to grant her the assistance. Although she is registered and has the right to take the assistance, he asked for something in return. He might ask her to go out with him, for example. She is obliged to. So you can see, exactly how that can play out. And as I said before, there's recommendations around sensitization, around very clear communication in multiple formats around eligibility and what people are entitled to, and also better accountability of aid workers and closer supervision for all of those, whether direct staff or contractors or private companies that aid agencies are working with. That they will be held accountable if they exploit that power. And we also see that power reflected in the household dynamics. And we've seen that in some of the discussion already around intimate partner violence and household decision-making. Just to share another quick quote from Empowered Aid, one of the humanitarian actors we talked to in Lebanon said that regarding cash, we heard a lot of problems about the bank e-cards. A lot of women were beaten by their spouses or brothers or sons just to take the card because it indicates that you have money. And there are a lot of problems knowing about how to use an ATM. So I can't emphasize enough, just multiple forms of proactive monitoring. There's always intended and unintended consequences. And if you're not hearing about issues that you don't expect, it probably means your monitoring isn't good enough and you're not asking in enough ways. There's a lot of misinformation and misunderstanding out there, and we really need to be sure we're really proactively asking all of those, and especially the people most affected and maybe least likely to reach out on their own when there are problems.
Really great examples of looking at the different layers, which we can unpack in research related to the individual, their community, and how they're interacting with the instruments we have. Tenzin, what are some of the thoughts you also have related to the research that you have been doing?
Yeah, echo everything that Elena shared. I think zooming out a little bit, thinking about practitioners themselves, the scoping research that WRC and partners did going into the development of our toolkit looked at current practice and what was getting in our way. And one of the key obstacles is that we're quite siloed across our communities of practice, even within our own organizations. We're not talking and working together enough across the cycle in order to do that gender analysis and then apply it. And then, as Elena mentioned, do the monitoring and then apply the findings, adapt accordingly. So I think that that siloing and this particular sub-Workstream is really helping us overcome that, right? But it comes down to personal and professional responsibility. I think that we know that we should be doing better. Research has been telling us that for a long time. We know that it's our collective responsibility to mainstream gender and GBV in the delivery of CVA. and we're long past that that moment. There's still too much externalizing the responsibility. Someone over there should do it. I don't have enough time, etc. And if we're really going to take forward good programming, we must do gender and protection analysis, or we're doing harm. So we need to get out of our own ways in order to do what we've all signed up to do. And we need to stop postponing the basics. As Alina mentioned, we need to consult communities in an inclusive way. We need to work together. We need to listen, design according to our community consultations, monitor to make sure we're doing no harm, tailor and adapt our programming, and be responsive. We need to be agile and use all of our dexterity to recognize that the diverse circumstances, needs, capacities, risks, and to get out of our own way to do better.
Okay, I love it. So if we don't have a good policy environment, we don't have the good research, but we, as practitioners, you know, we have some agency. We're on the ground, we're with the communities. What's getting in our way there, Sandra?
Yeah, well, I think that what Tenzin has spoken to is the fact that, you know, the burden is on us, right? So we're realizing that the burden is on us as practitioners and as agencies to really adapt our approaches, question our assumptions, and look more closely and listen more closely to what men and women are saying. So, you know, in the Pacific context, where we've been trying to bring things up to scale very quickly compared to other regions of the world, our main barriers have been around limited flexibility and limited creativity of thinking outside the programmatic frameworks and models that exist. You know, and trying to move outside the comfort zone of literally dragging and dropping lessons learned and programs, you know, into new environments. And, you know, for me, when I say being flexible and creative means acknowledging that we have our own intrinsic assumptions around gender roles. And those assumptions come out in the way that we program. When we automatically assume and tell a community that men will be violent, we're ascribing a role to them, you know, that we also need to question. So thinking around those corners, I think, is something that we've been definitely challenged to do. But also that, you know, we found that being flexible and creative and involving communities in that creativity and thinking around how you could tweak a program to work better for them in their environment is something that works really well from a program quality perspective, you know. So when we speak from the Pacific, we're in tiny, tiny environments, but we're in incredibly diverse environments, right? So Fiji has over 400 islands. Vanuatu has over 80 islands. A lot of people don't realize this. There are over 20,000 islands in the Pacific region. And what that means is that we need to be thinking in terms of people's roles within the broader context of their communities. And actually, when you go into a small community, they will be very quick to point out that the burden is on us to adapt and to learn what their way of doing is, and to consider the need for self-determination, not on the part of a country, certainly on the part of a community, but really thinking about self-determination from the perspective of the beneficiary, the man, the woman, and their agency as it relates to their community and their economy. And once you start looking at things in this way, as a practitioner, you start to find and reveal the paternalistic components of our more traditional programming models. And for us, in these tiny and very, very complex environments, the difference between listening or staying in your comfort zone, being flexible and creative, or just following what your, sorry, I'm a cash advisor, but what your cash advisor sent you without tweaking it, you know, listening to what a community says is and can be the difference between a man, a woman, and a community trusting you or not, as an individual, as an agency, and as a program. So, you know, from the practitioner's perspective, I think actually innovative programming comes out of thinking out of the box in this way and really listening to suggestions that allow us to diversify our programming in the same way that we're preaching to diversify our staff, our inclusion policies, etc. It's also something that applies to practice and program frameworks and design.
I love that. I love that innovation is listening to the communities that we're working with, and I totally agree with that one. One more question, ladies, for this fireside chat. I'm going to ask you to try to keep to 2 minutes so that we can have enough time. So my last question is this. So we're fighting the good fight, right? All of us that are on the call, we have 91 people on this call. It's really exciting. So we want to end on a positive note. What is one thing that you would like to see done this coming year to make #GenderCash a reality for the crisis-affected women and men of the world? How can we use our capabilities as humanitarians to transform the economic system for women and men to be mindful of who is making decisions in our agencies, who's at the table? So give me about two minutes each on your final thoughts. Anna, do you want to kick us off?
Sure. I think that Sandra's points just now, I think were a very good segue into what I was going to say on this, because I think that there's been so much really good discussion that's happening on inclusion and diversity. And frankly, I think what's really needed is an attitude change, I think, to really take up gender in a sincere way in our programming and in our policy and in our research. And so I think what we really need is to think about training and onboarding and the conversations that we're having with our own staff at staff meetings and even to that level. And so gender really needs to be a core part of our humanitarian language and thinking, including when we're talking about cash, because I think addressing the unique needs of women and girls, men and boys, is still not yet part of the DNA of emergency responses. And I know that we have been saying this for years, but we need to identify ways to bring gender back to the forefront of our staff thinking. Say back, but really this would be the first time I think that we've done it in a sincere way. I think it's frankly difficult to push our partners and policymakers to fully understand gender issues and program around them if they're not sufficiently armed with the training or fluent in the language around gender sensitive programming. So again, these conversations really need to happen in humanitarian partner headquarters and with field staff early and often to make that attitude shift. So making gender more central in programming involves training our staff from those early days, as I said, having those sincere and I think oftentimes kind of uncomfortable discussions to really push the envelope on this, because we need to push people and challenge people on their thinking. So we should always be asking, when we're having these dialogues in headquarters or in field staff, we should always be saying, what about women, girls, men, and boys, and not just in formal meetings or in proposals at the higher levels. This needs to happen all the time in onboarding, training, to push people. I think in many cases we have the tools to do this. It's just about prioritizing their use. Thanks.
Right. Being sincere early and often. I love it. Elena, what are your final thoughts on this, of how we can push this ahead in the next year?
Yeah, I think, Anna spoke really beautifully to the need to think of like the humanitarian ecosystem. And also when we're in communities, we want to think not only of the end user, but also, think of them in the larger community and ecosystem that they live in. And, what do they need to be able to safely exercise power, not only in accessing cash, but also in how they use it and how they can use it safely. And one of the big messages of the work that I've been doing is that, those most affected, and we're looking at SEA and AIDS, so we work with a diverse group of women and girls. They're experts in what we call contextual safeguarding. They're experts at knowing risky areas, risky places, risky situations, and strategies that they use to manage or mitigate those. And so when we think about cash assistance, if we're trying to meet people's needs with cash without really talking to them and understanding the risks that they face and bringing them in and having them be part of decision making and how these programs are set up and how those risks are managed, we're missing a tremendous amount of expertise and ability to really do that. And so we need to actively engage populations and the organizations that represent them, the local organizations. Sorry, I thought
I hear. No, we hear you. No, you're there still.
I was like, oh no. And I saw one of the, I think it was Kristen shared, there's going to be a session on local partnerships tomorrow. And that would be a fantastic place to hear more about that from people in, it looks like Nigeria and Uganda, Bangladesh, and South Sudan. And so just to really put a plug in for the how, I really hope that humanitarian stakeholders continue to embrace participatory methods in doing this, really engaging with communities with those most affected and bringing their power and their voice into research and programming. For Empowered Aid, which is funded by BPRM, which we're very grateful for, we've put all of our manuals and toolkits and everything we've used on the Global Women's Institute's website. So if this is new to you, or if you're looking for some training curriculum around gender and power, they're all up there. They're free to be adapted. There's a lot of other great resources out there. The CALP website is a fantastic website. So I think learning and sharing, as Sandra said, you know, like learning from other places, but also what does that mean in your context? And obviously there's a lot of expertise on this panel as well on how to do that. So that's my final plug.
Okay. Know your context, know it with the people that are from there, and make sure that they can use cash in a safe way. Some really key points there. Tenzin, what do you want to see happen in the next year?
Yeah, thank you. It's hard to narrow just to one, Holly, but
I didn't say one, but you could do it in 2 minutes. So talk really fast.
I think that I think that everything that's been shared so far is incredibly relevant, and I want to also echo Anna's call. I think that considering gender and GBV and cash, not kind of basic competencies, but as core competencies, right? And I think that we really need to, in order to push forward on the policy, practice, and research levels, to make sure that folks have the basic knowledge and skills. And those knowledge and skills help transform the attitudes, right, that we're really trying to shift. And I think will enable us to meet communities as experts in their own experience, in their own safeguarding, and how cash and voucher systems can support more gender transformation in their lives, more more safety in their lives. If we are better trained, we can meet them there in the way that we need to, and we should have been all this time. So I want to flag that there is, in addition to the Cash and GBV compendium, there's an in-person training package that's modular, available in lots of languages, will support donors, coordinators, GBV specialists, and humanitarian practitioners using cash to gain that basic knowledge and skills to move forward. And back to the time thing and around, excuses, these trainings are really short. I said they're modular. You could take half a day, a few hours of your time. Depending on the module, we all have half a day or full day to translate the commitments we've made into action, and the time is now. And I think that as we move forward on capacity building to make sure that our programming is of the highest quality, we need to be really inclusive. So all sorts of partners should be at the table. Again, really encourage folks to drive towards the localization conversations that are happening and move away from buzzwords into really meaningful partnerships, where those of us who are with international agencies or are kind of based in the North, that we're stepping back and really moving to a supportive role in our practice and in our research. Thanks.
Great. So train ourselves up, make sure that we have everyone at the table, a really inclusive group of people, so we can make this really part of our core. Kristen, I know you're on there. If you want to put a link for your event, which is on Thursday, we have a lot of folks that are on here that might be interested in it, since we've gotten a lot of shout outs to the localization aspect. Sandra, you get the last words in terms of what do we want to see for practice, maybe from your corner of the world for the evening that it is for you. You can have your last part of the fireside chat.
Thanks, Holly. I think we're at a point right now where actually everything around us, around the globe, around the world, is telling us to question the way that the habits that we have in doing things, right? To shift the way that we're engaging with each other, with our economies, the way that we're transacting with each other. And that applies to beneficiaries in our programs too. And so I think some of the people who are on this call, know that I'm like a big fan of innovation. And I truly believe that, innovation, and when I say innovation, I don't mean necessarily doing like sexy tech pilots, although
even if you are, but.
But what I mean is really thinking differently. So taking your existing program model, putting it down on paper and thinking, well, if I never had this to start with, how would I do this? Because this is what the post-COVID world is telling us, right? And I truly believe that when you speak to marginalized communities and populations especially, you'll find that innovation, new solutions, how to navigate, how to mitigate risk, that is all born out of hardship, right? So, and I'm saying this because in the Pacific region, we confronted a situation where, you know, cash was not being used or accepted as humanitarian assistance, where, you know, it's more likely that you're living on a fault line or near a volcano than you are close to an ATM machine or a bank. You know, and we need to consider that it is a real scenario that we may need to develop and create solutions that build a last mile where the bricks and mortar or the existing infrastructure can't help us, whether that's because of the pandemic, whether that's because of poor infrastructure, living in remote areas, you know, limitations on movement due to conflict. And all of this, I think, leads to the fact that right now we live in a digital age. And I think that in our silos, we tend to think about how do we change our programming, as opposed to thinking in depth about how do we change the financial instruments that we use to deliver cash, and acknowledge that those financial instruments have been excluding women and other groups for decades. We're now in a situation where we need to look at remote delivery, digital transfer mechanisms, contactless payments, and that for me is really an entry point for community inclusive innovation, iteration, and really starting to use our networks, which are international. We all have brands that are recognized, to reach out to the sectors in the world that we don't typically work with, the tech sector being one, to say, listen, the time is now. If we're ever going to find out a new way or develop a new system to deliver cash assistance in a way that our communities can participate in defining, developing, and testing, then, you know, at the end of the day, as humanitarian stakeholders, we're not in Silicon Valley. We're the ones who are present, you know, for mass adoption at the community level for the most marginalized groups. And we also bear that responsibility to keep up with this innovations game to make sure that the pace of solutions being created for COVID doesn't outpace humanitarian assistance at large. So it's something that I'm both worried about, but I also feel like we do have the resources to start to develop these types of solutions. We do have the capacities to consider that, you know, iteration with communities is an entry point for participation. Which means that marginalized people, gender groups, you know, and other groups are critical to those processes if we want to create tools that are truly relevant to them. So I guess just reminding everybody that, you know, this isn't, for me, it's not about thinking outside the box. I think we're at the point with COVID-19, especially if you're in a small apartment, of thinking about just breaking the box entirely and building new models for engagement that address a lot of the institutional and systematic issues that we've had around our programming in the past. And that includes our delivery channels, our supply chains, and even the way that we define how payments are reaching individuals. So I'm all for rebuilding things from the ground up. I know I'm making it sound very easy. It's not, but I think that, you know, communities would appreciate the fact that we're maybe rethinking the way that we program in order to adapt their situation and our situation together to what is a rapidly changing global environment that may not go back to normal as we know it.
Well, that is amazing. Thank you so much for ending on crisis as opportunity. And we couldn't escape COVID, of course, but in the last session of the last panelist, we did get to bring it up. So it really does give us that opportunity. I want to thank the four of you for contributing this, especially those that woke up early and those that stayed up late for this. I invite you, you can turn off your videos, but I do invite you to be able to participate in any questions there might be in the chat. So for the other folks that are on this call, if you have specific questions for the panelists, please feel free to go ahead. I'm going to go ahead with something that is maybe going to share where we see ourselves as the sub-working group. So just bear with me for one moment here to get into the presentation. Great. So after that exciting presentation, I'm going to run you through a little bit of what we have been doing overall to kind of meet those 3 areas of focus for us in the sub-work stream. And I'd point out that we are a combination both of Grand Bargain signatories and organizations that aren't Grand Bargain signatories, and bringing a diverse voice from NGOs, from UN, from donors, from the Red Cross, Red Crescent movement, and researchers. So you heard mention of the compendium, which is the Cash and Voucher Assistance in Gender-Based Violence Compendium, which is a compendium to the IS guidelines. It came out the year before, but in this past year, we've been able to have it translated into Spanish, French, and Arabic with the support of UNHCR. Tenzin also talked about the training modules which support them. So there are 5 different learning pathways in there and 3 different modules which are available in 3 different languages. We were able to do a pilot training of those in Nairobi. We had 39 participants from 10 contexts. It really was a variety from East and Southern Africa and also the Middle East. So some good uptake for that. The operational guidelines in gender and cash and voucher assistance, which was put out by UN Women, was released during this period, and this had been peer reviewed and has become an important tool for folks to be able to meaningfully use, to think and understand how to program for gender equality. Before we had the webinar fatigue, we were able to do 8 webinars, which was a series on cash and voucher assistance in GBV. We were able to do 1 in French and Spanish. Really great contributions from 7 different agencies. Almost 600 people expressed interest in it. And really important to point out is we have continued views for these. We've seen in some of the webinars over 100 views since we did them. So these are continual tools for folks to be able to use. We were able to co-sponsor a webinar with a focus on Latin America, which focused on cash and voucher assistance in COVID in the region. It was done in Spanish with a variety of other actors who in the region. So a really great collaborative effort. And over 200 participants. Cash and voucher assistance is a little bit more nascent in that region. And so there really is a strong level of interest there. The sub-Workstream has also sponsored some research. Some of you will remember in 2019 there was a meeting with 40 practitioners, where we were able to identify key areas of inquiry. And so one of those was able to be funded from a microgrant from IDEA, which is Implementer-Led Design, Evidence, and Analysis Learning, which is through Food for Peace. And it is an ongoing research which is looking at US government-funded multimodal responses, so responses which have used cash or vouchers with either in-kind or service delivery, and seeing ones that have more positive gender outcomes to be able to help us better program as a community. We expect those final products to be out in 2021. Also made reference, Anna mentioned this tip sheet that we were able to put out for gender and cash and COVID-19. So this was something that was not on our work plan, but we were able to put out through a collaborative effort. And again, really trying to make sure that we're reaching at least the major 4 working languages. So you can say by our work plan, for the most part, we were able to, COVID didn't get in our way. We were able to do a lot of our own work. There's a few that are ongoing that we'll bring forward to next year. What I do want to take a little bit of time in is talking about the next steps for the sub-work stream. So our members, we got together last week and we tried to figure out what have we done and where should we go. So what we think that we've done very well is we've made noise about #GenderCash, and we are visible. More people are talking about it. It's so exciting to see over 90 people on this call that you have interest in this topic and that is important to you. But what we are concerned about is, are we making noise with and for the people that need it the most? We don't want to have the same people in the virtual room at this point or in the physical room in the near future, but are we able to have the people that need it the most, the people that we've referenced in that fireside chat? We know that the guidance is out there, but are there tangible changes being made in the lives of crisis-affected women, men, boys, girls, and non-binary people? This is what we need to be able to understand. COVID-19 has revealed that even more so, gender inequity is, well, it's kind of blown the dust off of what exists already. And so how can we do better moving ahead when we get to the point of recovery, making it part of our normal business? And we also agree that there's a lot more to do, and we want to find good ways to do it as the cash work stream. So we have a bit of a manifesto for 2020, 2021. We want to continue to generate user-friendly gender and cash resources. So when we mean user-friendly, it is, again, it is pointed to people that are going to be, you know, the ones that are in the field, the ones that are making decisions, the ones that are coming up with research topics. And we want to make sure that that is shared. It's getting into the hands, getting into the ears, getting into the eyes of people who need it the most. And one of the areas that we really want to be able to focus is to unlock the barriers to uptake. Again, there is guidance that exists, but why aren't people able to use it? Is it not accessible in the language? Is it not accessible in the format? We need to understand how can we get people to be able to use this. And we want to focus on field-based practitioners through virtual means, which is where COVID has sent us, but it also, again, as Sandra had referred to, this is crisis as opportunity. It's a way for us to be more inclusive and more equitable in humanitarian action. And we do, as has been brought up before, want to make meaningful connections to the localization sub-workstream within the cash workstream. There's also a social protection one, which we have been participating in a bit, but we want to have meaningful connections to that. And also to the larger Friends of Gender group, which is an overall group within the cash workstream. And so that really gives us an opportunity to work on some of the policy issues that we can unlock and reach a more broader group of organizations. But most importantly, what we want to do is to make sure that front and center are the crisis-affected women, men, boys, and girls in all of the actions that we're doing. So what we're doing is for them and trying to improve our practice, making sure that we are bringing into our analysis what they understand, the opportunities they see, the things that they fear, and making sure that the process that we're continually improving our humanitarian action. So that is front and center. So that is our presentation for the day. We could hang out for a few more minutes if there are any questions. I'm going to stop sharing. I don't know if there are, if you all have any questions that you want to ask. I think you can put up your hand or you can type into the chat if you want to do that. Yes, we will definitely share the presentation, and the tip sheet. What you'll see in the presentation is that it has hyperlinks to all of the materials that I have referenced to make sure that you guys can have good access to them. I'm going to if you want to be able to unmute yourself, I think you should be able to do it now. There's somebody who has a question. While you're thinking, I forgot to launch my poll. For those of you that are still on the line, we just wanted to get a sense of who you are. So you should be able to see on your screen just 2 quick questions of what your specialty is, and then the primary area of work, so that we can best adapt the offerings that we have. Okay, we have about half of you who've been able to participate. About a little bit more than half. I'll keep the polling up for a little bit longer. A few more folks. Okay. I hope you will see this in a moment. So a lot of us are cash folks, which isn't surprising. A good mixture there within gender, GBV, and glad to see that we have about 35% of you that are working at response or country level. those are our last mile folks that we want to be able to get in touch with. Okay. Great. Well, I want to thank you all for your interest in the presentations. We'll share it back out. If you do have any questions related to hashtag gender cash, please feel free to reach out to me. We're really happy to be able to have other people participating, letting us know how we're doing, so that we can improve the lives of crisis-affected populations through our cash and voucher assistance. I wish you all a great morning, afternoon, and evening, and thank you for joining.